I arrived home exhausted after a 3-day inspection assignment in another district. The drive had been long, traffic had been terrible, and all I wanted was to collapse on my couch with a cold beer and mindless television. As I turned onto my street, however, I knew something was terribly wrong. The usual quiet of our suburban neighborhood had been replaced by pulsating music, and cars lined both sides of the road, making it nearly impossible to navigate. When I finally managed to pull into my driveway, or at least what should have been my driveway, I found it blocked by a massive barbecue stand with a banner that read, "Oak Ridge Community Street Festival, sponsored by HOA." The scene before me was total chaos. My entire front yard had been transformed into a bustling fairground, complete with food stands, a small stage where a local band was setting up, and dozens of strangers milling about on what was, undeniably, my private property. "What in the world is happening on my front lawn?" I muttered, unable to process the invasion taking place. If you've ever experienced such a moment of utter disbelief in your own neighborhood, drop a comment below about where you're from. I'm genuinely curious if any place can top the audacity of what I was witnessing. I parked on the street 3 houses down, the closest spot available, and walked back to my property, my confusion rapidly giving way to anger. Decorative string lights had been hung from my porch railings without permission. A bouncy castle occupied the left corner of my yard, children screaming with delight as they jumped inside the inflatable monstrosity. Tables and chairs were arranged in neat rows on my lawn, which had been meticulously maintained until now but was rapidly being trampled into mud. The scene was surreal, as if I had accidentally stumbled onto a movie set. People glanced at me curiously as I made my way through the crowd toward my own front door, but no one questioned my presence. They assumed I was just another festival attendee. I spotted her before she saw me. Karen Richardson, the self-appointed queen of our homeowners association, directing a group of volunteers as they set up additional tables. Her perfectly highlighted blonde bob gleamed in the afternoon sun, her gestures sharp and authoritative as she pointed where each item should go. Karen saw me approaching and her expression shifted, not to guilt or embarrassment as one might expect from someone who had commandeered another person's property, but to mild annoyance, as if my arrival was an inconvenience to her carefully orchestrated event. "Oh, you're back," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone she reserved for those she considered beneath her notice. "We thought you'd be gone all week. The HOA approved use of this space for our annual street festival. It's going to be such a wonderful community builder." The way she emphasized community made it clear that in her mind, individual property rights were secondary to her vision of neighborhood harmony. A harmony she defined and enforced with iron-fisted determination. I stared at her, momentarily speechless, trying to formulate a response that wouldn't involve the string of profanities building in my throat. I'd dealt with Karen before, of course. Everyone in Oak Ridge had. She was notorious for her zealous enforcement of HOA regulations, sending violation notices for grass half an inch too tall or mailboxes painted the wrong shade of black. "Karen," I said finally, keeping my voice low and controlled, "this is my private property. You can't just set up a festival in my yard without my permission." I was acutely aware of the spectators gathering around us, eager for drama. Karen's smile never faltered, though it didn't reach her eyes, which had taken on a steely glint. "Actually," she replied with exaggerated patience, as if explaining a simple concept to a child, "the HOA bylaws clearly state that front yards are considered community aesthetic spaces. We've filed all the proper paperwork for this event. It's completely within our rights." This was, of course, complete nonsense. I knew the HOA regulations inside and out, better than Karen did, in fact, though she didn't know that yet. As a city inspector, I'd reviewed countless HOA bylaws and knew exactly where the boundaries of their authority ended. But I wasn't ready to reveal that card just yet. Something told me to wait, to gather evidence, to let Karen dig herself into a hole so deep she couldn't climb out. "I'd like to see that paperwork," I said calmly, watching her reaction carefully. For a moment, uncertainty flickered across her face before she regained her composure. "It's all filed at the HOA office," she replied dismissively. "Feel free to make an appointment to review it next week. In the meantime, we have a festival to run." She turned away, effectively dismissing me from my own property. "And please move your car," she called over her shoulder. "That space is reserved for our vendor deliveries." I stood there, taking slow, deep breaths, looking at the banner that now hung across my porch. Oak Ridge Street Festival by HOA Karen in large, garish letters. The smaller print below it caught my eye. Vendor spots available, $75 each. So that was it? Karen wasn't just on a power trip, she was making money from this venture. My lips curved into a small, tight smile as I walked toward my front door. Oh, Karen would soon discover exactly who she was dealing with. I had purchased my house in Oak Ridge Estates 9 months earlier, attracted by the well-maintained neighborhood and proximity to both my office and the city's best parks. The Homeowners Association had been mentioned during the closing process, of course, but the real estate agent had glossed over it with vague assurances about reasonable rules that keep property values high. What she hadn't mentioned was that our HOA was essentially Karen Richardson's personal fiefdom, a platform from which she could exercise control over her neighbors under the guise of community standards. Our first encounter had occurred barely a week after I moved in, when she left a neon pink violation notice on my door regarding the positioning of my trash cans, which were apparently visible from the street by approximately 2 inches. "First warning," the notice had read, as if I'd committed a serious crime rather than a minor infraction of a rule I hadn't yet memorized. In the months that followed, Karen had found numerous opportunities to remind me of my place in her hierarchy. My mailbox was the wrong shade of black, despite being the original one that came with the house. The wreath on my door during the winter holidays incorporated non-approved colors. I had parked my car in my own driveway, but left it there for more than 48 hours while I was sick with the flu, violating some obscure regulation about street aesthetic. Each infraction came with a notice, each notice with Karen's signature and a reminder that continued violations could result in fines. What Karen didn't know, what I had deliberately kept quiet, was my occupation. As a city inspector for municipal code enforcement, I spent my days ensuring buildings and properties complied with local regulations. I understood property law, zoning requirements, permit necessities, and the legal limitations of entities like homeowners associations better than most attorneys. I'd kept this information to myself, partly because I valued my privacy, and partly because I'd learned long ago that knowledge was power, best wielded when others underestimated you. The irony was that Karen had particularly fixated on my property because it was one of the larger corner lots in the development, with an expansive front yard that was visible from multiple angles. Where I saw a maintenance burden, all that grass to mow, Karen saw a showcase for her authority. A prominent location where her influence could be displayed for all to see. I'd overheard her at a previous neighborhood gathering telling another HOA board member, "That corner property has so much potential if the owner would just follow the guidelines. It could be the jewel of the neighborhood." Translation: if I surrendered control of my property to her vision, she could use it as her personal showcase. But today's festival was a new level of audacity, even for Karen. Using my yard without permission was not just a breach of etiquette, it was trespassing, pure and simple. And the fact that she was charging vendors for space on my property, that crossed the line from annoying to potentially illegal. Inside my house, I pulled out my laptop and began reviewing the HOA covenant documents I had saved. As I suspected, there was absolutely nothing in the bylaws that gave the HOA authority to commandeer private front yards for community events. There were provisions for common areas, community clubhouse usage, and even guidelines for requesting that homeowners participate in neighborhood beautification projects, but nothing that would permit what Karen was doing. I then turned to the city municipal code, pulling up regulations regarding public gatherings, noise ordinances, temporary structures, and vendor permits. By the time I finished my research, I had compiled a comprehensive list of at least a dozen violations occurring on my property at that very moment. I smiled grimly as I printed out the relevant documents, highlighting key passages. Time to play by the rules, I murmured to myself, arranging the papers in a fold. Karen's rules are about to meet city code. I returned to my front yard, legal folder in hand, and found the festival had grown even more crowded in the hour I'd spent researching. A face-painting station had been set up dangerously close to my garage door, and a group of teenagers were arranging folding chairs in a semicircle around a small amplifier system for what appeared to be an upcoming performance. The noise level had increased substantially, with the band now playing at full volume, and the smell of grilled food permeated the air. I spotted Karen near the refreshment table, surrounded by a group of admirers, mostly other HOA committee members and their spouses, who hung on her every word as if she were delivering profound wisdom rather than gossiping about the neighbor whose Halloween decorations had remained up until November 3rd last year. I approached the group, waiting patiently at the edge until Karen finally acknowledged my presence with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Karen, we need to talk," I said, keeping my voice pleasant but firm. "Privately, if possible." Her smile became even more strained as she excused herself from her admirers, leading me a few steps away, though still very much on my property. "If this is about the festival, I've already explained that everything is completely authorized," she said dismissively, glancing around as if looking for someone more important to speak with. I opened my folder and removed a printout of the HOA bylaws. "Actually, I've been reviewing the covenant, and there's nothing in here that gives the HOA authority to use private property for community events without the owner's consent. Section 4.3 specifically addresses the use of common areas for gatherings, but front yards are categorically defined as private property in Section 1.2. I pointed to the highlighted passages, watching as Karen's expression shifted from dismissive to defensive. "That's your interpretation," she said, making no effort to actually read the document I was holding. "The board has a broader understanding of the community aesthetic clause." "What community aesthetic clause?" I asked, knowing full well no such clause existed. "The one that allows for community engagement activities," Karen stuttered, clearly fabricating as she went along. "It's all perfectly legal. We've been doing this festival for years." I raised an eyebrow. "On other people's front yards without permission? I'd be interested to know who those homeowners were, or is my property being specially selected for some reason?" Karen's cheeks flushed slightly, but she recovered quickly. "Your lot has the most suitable space. It's a compliment, really. We're showcasing your property as a community gathering place." I nearly laughed at the audacity. "A compliment would have been asking me first. And I notice you're charging vendors for spots on my private property. Where does that money go exactly?" Karen's eyes narrowed dangerously. "That money goes to the HOA treasury for community improvements. Not that it's any of your business how we manage HOA funds." Our conversation was interrupted by Tyler Matthews, a young homeowner who lived 2 doors down from me. I didn't know him well, but I recognized him as one of Karen's faithful followers, always quick to agree with her at neighborhood meetings. "Is everything okay here?" he asked, looking between Karen and me with obvious concern. "Just fine, Tyler," Karen said with forced brightness. "Our newest neighbor is just getting acquainted with how we do things in Oak Ridge." The way she emphasized newest was clearly meant to remind me of my outsider status, as if longevity in the neighborhood somehow trumped property rights. Tyler nodded sympathetically, though it wasn't clear which of us he was sympathizing with. "The festival is always such a great tradition," he offered tentatively. "Everyone looks forward to it all year." I wondered if he was one of the homeowners who had previously hosted the event, or if Karen had always managed to impose it on newcomers who didn't know any better. "Traditions are important," I agreed neutrally, "but so are property rights and city ordinances." I turned back to Karen. "For instance, do you have a city permit for this gathering? There are clearly more than 75 people here, which triggers the requirement for a public assembly permit." Karen's confident facade faltered slightly. "We don't need a city permit. This is a private neighborhood event." I shook my head. "Not according to Municipal Code 5.420.6. which defines public assembly as any gathering of more than 75 people in a residential area, regardless of whether it's restricted to certain invitees. And then there's the matter of the temporary structures, food service permits for these vendors, noise ordinance compliance. I let the sentence trail off, watching the realization dawn on Karen's face that I knew far more about regulations than the average homeowner. Before she could respond, a woman approached us, Linda Martinez, one of the few neighbors who had been consistently friendly since I moved in, often bringing over baked goods and offering gardening advice. Linda gave me a warm smile before turning a considerably cooler gaze on Karen. "Everything all right here?" she asked, echoing Tyler's earlier question but with a very different tone. I could see Karen calculating her response, aware that Linda was one of the few neighbors who openly challenged her authority. "Just explaining the festival procedures to our new neighbor," Karen said stiffly. Linda raised an eyebrow. "Did you actually get permission to use this yard? Because I distinctly remember last year's festival was at the community park." Karen's lips thinned to a nearly invisible line. "The board made a decision to relocate for better visibility." Linda looked at me questioningly, and I gave a small shake of my head. She understood immediately. "So that's a no on the permission," she stated flatly. Karen's face flushed with anger, but before she could respond, she was called away by another committee member who needed her input on some urgent festival matter. As she stormed off, she called over her shoulder, "This festival is happening whether you like it or not. The community has spoken." After Karen's departure, Linda stayed with me, surveying the chaos that had overtaken my front yard. "I'm sorry about this," she said quietly. "Karen's gotten worse since she was re-elected as HOA president last year. Goes to show what happens when only 12 people bother to vote in a neighborhood of 80 homes." I nodded, watching as a group of children ran across my lawn, their shoes leaving muddy tracks on the grass I'd carefully maintained. "I'm documenting everything," I told her, pulling out my phone and beginning to take photos and videos of the various violations occurring throughout my property. Linda looked at me curiously. "You seem surprisingly calm about all this. Most people would be yelling by now." I smiled slightly. "Let's just say I have some experience with regulations and enforcement." Linda's eyes widened with interest, but she didn't press for details, which I appreciated. Instead, she pointed toward a row of parked cars blocking a fire hydrant. "Don't forget to get that. It's a clear safety violation." For the next hour, I methodically documented every aspect of the unauthorized festival. I photographed the vendor booths with their cash boxes and lack of permits, recorded the decibel levels of the band using a sound meter app on my phone, noted the extension cords running across walkways creating tripping hazards, and watched as alcohol was served without proper licensing. I was particularly careful to document Karen's direct involvement, capturing videos of her collecting cash from vendors and directing the placement of equipment on my property. Throughout this process, I maintained a neutral expression, just another resident wandering through the festival with my phone out. No different from dozens of others taking photos for social media. But unlike them, each image and video I captured was building a comprehensive case against Karen and her unauthorized use of my property. As I conducted my surveillance, I became aware of subtle dynamics among the attendees. While many seemed to be genuinely enjoying the festival, others appeared uncomfortable, casting apologetic glances my way when they thought Karen wasn't looking. Jeff Peterson, another HOA board member who I knew primarily through neighborhood meetings, lingered near my garage, looking conflicted. When Karen was occupied with directing the setup of a children's games area, he approached me hesitantly. "Look," he said in a low voice, glancing around to ensure we weren't overheard, "I just want you to know that not all of us on the board approved this. Karen pushed it through during a special session when some members were absent." I raised an eyebrow, continuing to record video while we spoke. "Is that so?" "That sounds like a violation of your own bylaws regarding quorum requirements." Jeff looked surprised, then nodded slowly. "You know, you're right. I hadn't thought of it that way." He paused, then added, "She claimed she had your permission, said you'd agreed weeks ago." Jeff's revelation didn't surprise me. It fit perfectly with Karen's pattern of behavior, but it did provide another valuable piece of evidence. "Would you be willing to put that in writing?" I asked casually. Jeff hesitated, clearly torn between doing the right thing and facing Karen's inevitable wrath. "I'll think about it," he said finally, before drifting away as Karen looked in our direction. I didn't push. The seed had been planted, and I suspected Jeff might prove useful later when Karen's position began to crumble. Meanwhile, the festival continued to grow more chaotic. A troupe of dancers in elaborate costumes began a performance directly in front of my porch, their feathered headdresses bobbing perilously close to my windows. As I attempted to enter my own home, one of them spun around, nearly colliding with me, causing me to stumble backward in surprise. The dancer apologized profusely, but I noticed Karen watching from across the yard, a satisfied smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. She clearly thought I was overwhelmed and outsmarted. Linda found me again as I was documenting a particularly egregious safety violation, a propane grill positioned directly beneath low-hanging tree branches. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "you could just call the city. They'd shut this down in a heartbeat with all these violations." I smiled, continuing to record the scene before me. "I appreciate the suggestion, but I have something a bit more comprehensive in mind." Linda studied my face for a moment, then a slow smile spread across her features. "You're planning something, aren't you?" I neither confirmed nor denied, but my expression must have given me away because Linda laughed softly. "Whatever it is, I want front row seats when it happens. Karen's had this coming for a long time." I nodded, sliding my phone back into my pocket. The battery was running low after all the documentation, but I had more than enough evidence. Now it was time to prepare the official response. "If you'll excuse me," I told Linda, "I need to make a few calls." As I headed back toward my house, I caught sight of Karen directing a group of volunteers to set up additional lighting for the evening portion of the festival, her voice carrying across the yard as she instructed them to use my outdoor electrical outlets without a moment's hesitation. I paused on my porch, looking back at the chaos that had engulfed my property, and reached for my phone once more. Not to take additional pictures, but to make a call that would set the next phase of my plan in motion. By early evening, the festival was in full swing. String lights twinkled overhead, music pulsed from the speakers, and the aroma of various foods filled the air. Karen took to the small stage erected near my driveway, tapping the microphone for attention. "Welcome everyone to our annual Oak Ridge Street Festival," she announced to enthusiastic applause. "We're so fortunate to have this beautiful space available to us this year," she continued, carefully avoiding any mention of who actually owned the property. Her gaze occasionally drifted to where I stood, a challenging glint in her eye that seemed to say, "See? Everyone loves this. You can't possibly object without looking like the villain." It was a clever manipulation tactic. Make the individual who stands up for their rights appear to be against the community good. I slipped through the crowd, documenting everything. I observed Karen moving from vendor to vendor, collecting cash payments that disappeared directly into her purse with no receipts issued. I positioned myself close enough to one exchange to overhear her telling a jewelry vendor, "Yes, the space fee is $75 cash only. Premium visibility costs extra." The situation deteriorated as the evening progressed. Cars parked haphazardly, blocking driveways and fire hydrants. Music volume exceeding ordinance limits. Unsupervised children creating chaos. And elderly neighbors' noise complaints being dismissed by Karen's committee members. I gathered evidence through casual conversations with attendees. A mother struggling with her crying toddler confirmed my suspicions when she mentioned, "I've lived here 3 years and they've never done anything this large before. Usually, it's just a small gathering at the community center." At precisely 9:15 p.m., I stepped to a quiet corner of my backyard and made a call. "Hello, Jim. It's time to activate Protocol 17B. "Yes?" "At my address. Bring the full team. This is going to be educational." I returned to the front yard where the festival had reached a fever pitch. Karen stood near the stage, a self-satisfied smile on her face as she surveyed her kingdom, my yard, with evident pride of ownership. I checked my watch. 20 minutes until Karen's reign would come to an abrupt and very public end. As I waited for my reinforcements to arrive, I noticed a change in Karen's demeanor. She was no longer basking in the festival's success, but instead huddled with Tyler and 2 other HOA board members, gesturing emphatically in my direction. It appeared that my documentation activities hadn't gone as unnoticed as I'd hoped. I maintained my position, continuing to observe from a distance, but it soon became clear that Karen was mobilizing her forces. She broke away from the group and approached me directly, her smile tight and her eyes cold. "Enjoying the festival?" she asked with false sweetness. I returned her smile with equal insincerity. "It's certainly an interesting use of private property." Karen's smile didn't falter, but her eyes narrowed dangerously. "You know, I've been reviewing your HOA compliance file. It seems there are several outstanding issues with your property that haven't been addressed." I raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to continue. Karen pulled out her phone, making a show of consulting some notes. "Let's see. Your front hedge exceeds the maximum height by 3 inches. Your mailbox needs repainting. The approved shade is midnight black, not charcoal black. And you installed a bird feeder without submission of a proper landscaping modification form." Each alleged violation was more trivial than the last, and all were clearly fabricated or exaggerated. I had been meticulously careful about compliance precisely because I knew how HOA rules could be weaponized by people like Karen. "Is that so?" I replied mildly. "I'd be interested to see the documentation on those violations. When were the inspections conducted?" Karen waved her hand dismissively. "The HOA board conducts regular evaluations. The point is, continued non-compliance could result in significant fines. In extreme cases, even property liens or eviction proceedings." The threat was clear, if absurdly overblown. Karen was attempting to intimidate me into silence, using the only power she believed she had over me. "That sounds serious," I said, maintaining my calm exterior. "Perhaps we should discuss this after consulting with our respective legal representatives." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Karen's face. Most homeowners back down when threatened with HOA penalties, not escalated to legal counsel. She recovered quickly, however. "There's no need for lawyers. The HOA covenant you signed gives us clear authority, but I'm sure we could come to an arrangement regarding these violations if you were to become more cooperative about community activities." And there it was, the quid pro quo. The veiled suggestion that she would overlook my alleged infractions if I stopped objecting to her use of my property. It was exactly the kind of petty abuse of power I had suspected, now confirmed by her own words. Erin must have mistaken my silence for capitulation because she pressed what she perceived as her advantage. "The annual HOA inspection is coming up next month. Properties with multiple violations can face compounded penalties. And given that you're still within your first year of residency, the board has additional oversight provisions that could make things difficult." This was complete fiction. There were no special provisions for new residents in our HOA covenant, but Karen clearly wasn't expecting me to know that. I nodded thoughtfully, as if considering her words carefully. "I see. And if I were to be more accommodating about the festival, what then?" Karen's expression shifted to one of triumph. "I'm sure the board could overlook minor infractions for homeowners who demonstrate community spirit, and of course being on good terms with the HOA has many benefits." I nodded again, watching as she interpreted my response as surrender. "Go on with your festival," I said finally. "We'll talk tomorrow." Karen practically glowed with victory as she walked away, already planning how to share her successful intimidation with her inner circle. I checked my watch again. Any minute now. As if on cue, Linda appeared at my side, having witnessed the entire exchange from a discreet distance. "What was that all about?" she asked quietly. "Karen looked like a cat who got the canary." I couldn't help but smile slightly. "She thinks she's won. Let her enjoy it for about—" I glanced at my watch one more time. 3 more minutes. Linda looked at me with renewed curiosity. "What exactly do you do for a living? You've never actually said." I was saved from responding by the distant sound of sirens, growing steadily louder as they approached our neighborhood. "That," I said with satisfaction, "is the sound of karma arriving." Karen heard the sirens too. I watched as her head snapped up, her expression shifting from confusion to alarm, as two police cruisers, a fire marshal's vehicle, and a city code enforcement van turned onto our street, lights flashing. The music abruptly cut off as festival attendees turned to stare at the procession of official vehicles. Karen's face had gone pale, her eyes darting around as if seeking an escape route. Then her gaze locked on me, standing calmly with Linda, and understanding dawned on her features. She marched toward me, fury evident in every line of her body. "You called the authorities?" she hissed when she reached us. "You would ruin a community event out of spite?" I met her gaze steadily. "I didn't call them out of spite, Karen. I called them because you're hosting an illegal event on private property without permits or safety precautions. The spite was all on your end when you decided to steamroll over property rights and city ordinances." Before Karen could respond, the officials had exited their vehicles and were approaching the festival area. I recognized Jim Peterson, the head of the City Code Enforcement Division and my direct supervisor, leading the group. Karen intercepted them, switching instantly from fury to charm. "Officers, Fire Marshal, welcome to our neighborhood festival. Is there something we can help you with?" Her voice was honey-sweet, her smile dazzling, but Jim wasn't impressed. "Ma'am, we've received reports of multiple code violations and safety concerns at this event. I'll need to speak with the organizer immediately." Karen's smile faltered only slightly. "That would be me. Karen Richardson, Oak Ridge Estates, HOA President. I assure you everything is in order. We've been hosting this festival for years." Jim looked past her to where I stood. "Is that so? Then I'm sure you can provide the necessary permits, public assembly, food service, noise variance, temporary structure authorization, vendor licensing." Karen's confident facade cracked further as Jim listed each required permit, none of which she possessed. "Well, this is a private neighborhood event," she stammered. "We didn't think all that bureaucratic red tape was necessary for a simple community gathering." Jim's expression remained professionally neutral, but I could see the slight tightening around his eyes that indicated his disapproval. "Ma'am, any gathering of this size requires proper permits, regardless of whether it's a neighborhood event. Additionally, we've received information that this festival is taking place on private property without the owner's consent. Is that correct?" Karen's gaze darted to me again, realization dawning that this was no ordinary neighbor she had tried to bully. "The HOA has authority over front yard usage for community events." Jim turned to me, eyebrow raised. "Is that your understanding as the property owner inspector?" The collective gasp from the onlookers when Jim addressed me as inspector was audible. Karen's eyes widened in shock, her mouth opening and closing without producing sound as she processed this new information. I stepped forward, pulling my city inspector identification from my pocket and holding it up. "Karen," I said calmly, "I don't believe we've been properly introduced. In addition to being your neighbor, I'm a senior code enforcement inspector for the city. And no, the HOA does not have authority to commandeer private property for events, community or otherwise." Karen stared at my identification badge as if it might bite her, the color draining from her face. For perhaps the first time since I'd met her, Karen Richardson was utterly speechless. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Tyler stepped forward, looking confused and anxious. "You're a city inspector. Why didn't you say anything before?" I turned to address not just Tyler, but the growing crowd of neighbors who had gathered to watch the confrontation. "I value my privacy, and I don't generally bring my work home with me, but when someone illegally occupies my property, charges vendors for the privilege of setting up on my land, and then threatens me with fabricated HOA violations when I object, well, that's when my professional expertise becomes relevant." Jim nodded, turning to the police officers and fire marshal who had accompanied him. "Let's do a complete inspection. I want documentation of every code violation, safety hazard, and permit irregularity." The officials dispersed throughout the festival, clipboards and cameras in hand, while Karen remained frozen in place, watching her carefully constructed authority crumble before her eyes. This is an abuse of power," she finally managed to sputter. "You're using your position to harass the HOA." The accusation was so absurd that I couldn't help but laugh. "Karen, let me explain how power works in this situation. You, as HOA president, have authority to enforce agreed-upon covenant restrictions within the boundaries of state and local law. You do not have authority to seize private property, run commercial operations without permits, or violate city ordinances." I turned to the gathering of neighbors, many of whom were watching with expressions ranging from shock to barely concealed delight. For those who aren't aware, this festival violates at least 15 separate city codes, including those related to noise levels, food service sanitation, public assembly, fire safety, and commercial activity in residential zones. None of the required permits were obtained, none of the necessary safety inspections were performed, and most importantly, this event is taking place on private property, my property, without consent. Karen attempted to rally, drawing herself up to her full height. "The HOA covenant clearly states," I cut her off, holding up a hand. "I've read the covenant, Karen, every word of it. There is no provision that allows the HOA to use private property without owner consent, charge vendors for space on said property, or override city ordinances regarding public gatherings." Jim stepped forward, his expression grave. "Ms. Richardson, I'll need to see any documentation you have regarding permits for this event." Karen's confident facade cracked further. The HOA has always handled these matters internally. The permit seemed like unnecessary red tape for a simple neighborhood gathering." Jim's eyebrows rose. "A simple gathering with over 100 attendees, commercial food service, amplified music, and temporary structures? That requires permits, ma'am. Every time." As Jim spoke, the other officials were conducting their inspection, their expressions growing increasingly concerned as they documented violation after violation. The fire marshal was particularly disturbed by the propane grills positioned under tree branches and the extension cords creating tripping hazards across evacuation routes. One of the police officers was questioning vendors about their payments to Karen, while another was addressing the illegally parked vehicles blocking access for emergency vehicles. The scene was rapidly transforming from a festive gathering to a systematic dismantling of Karen's unauthorized event. Through it all, Karen stood rooted to the spot, her expression cycling through shock, anger, disbelief, and finally the beginnings of fear as she realized the potential consequences of her action. "I had no idea," she began weakly, but I wasn't having it. "You had every idea, Karen. You knew this was my property. You knew you hadn't secured proper permits. You knew you were collecting money from vendors without authorization. What you didn't know was that I was in a position to do something about it." Linda had moved to stand beside me, her expression a mixture of amazement and satisfaction. "I can't believe you kept this quiet for so long," she murmured. I shrugged slightly. "Like I said, I value my privacy. But more importantly, I believe in following proper procedures, which is exactly what's happening now." Around us, festival attendees were beginning to disperse, vendors hurriedly packing up their wares as they realized the event was being shut down. The band members were dismantling their equipment, casting nervous glances at the police officers documenting the scene. Jim approached with his clipboard, shaking his head in disbelief. "In 15 years of code enforcement, I've rarely seen this many violations in one location. The noise alone is nearly double the permitted decibel level for residential areas." He turned to Karen, who had been joined by the remaining HOA board members, including Jeff, who was keeping a noticeable distance from her. "Ms. Richardson, as the organizer of this event, you're responsible for these violations. We'll be issuing citations for each infraction, and there may be additional consequences pending further investigation." Karen's face had gone from pale to ashen. "Citations? But this was a community event. We were building neighborhood spirit." Jim remained unmoved by her protests. "Building community spirit doesn't exempt you from following the law, ma'am. The citations will be delivered to your home within 3 business days." As the officials continued their work, neighbors began approaching me, some apologetic, others curious. "I had no idea you were a city inspector," one elderly woman said, shaking her head. "Karen told everyone you were difficult and uncooperative, but I always thought you kept your yard so nice." I smiled at the compliment. "Thank you. And I'm not usually one to make a scene, but there are limits to what should be tolerated, even from the HOA. Tyler hovered nearby, clearly unsure whether to approach, his loyalty to Karen warring with the undeniable evidence of her overreach. Finally, he stepped forward. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I should have questioned things more. When Karen said she had permission..." I waved away his apology. "You were misled, like everyone else. The important thing is that the situation is being corrected. Around us, the once bustling festival had transformed into an orderly evacuation, supervised by police to ensure safety as people departed." Karen made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation, approaching Jim with a forced smile. "Surely we can work something out. This is just a misunderstanding between neighbors. Perhaps a warning this time?" Jim looked at her impassively. "Ms. Richardson? This isn't a parking ticket. You've violated multiple city codes, potentially endangered public safety, and trespassed on private property. There will be consequences." Karen's smile vanished, replaced by a look of panic. "But the HOA can't afford major fines. We'd have to raise dues, and everyone will blame me." Her concern was clearly for herself rather than the community she claimed to serve. I stepped forward, meeting Karen's gaze directly. "The festival is over, Karen. Pack up your things and leave my property. Now." For a moment I thought she might argue further, but the combined authority of the city officials and the growing disapproval of her neighbors finally silenced her. Without another word, she turned and walked away, her shoulders slumped in defeat. The aftermath of the festival's shutdown reverberated through Oak Ridge Estates for days. Karen received citations for 17 separate code violations, with fines totaling over $15,000. As HOA president, she had organized the event under the association's name, meaning the HOA Treasury, not Karen personally, was legally responsible for the penalties. This led to an emergency HOA board meeting 3 days after the festival fiasco, with unprecedented attendance. Nearly 60 homeowners packed the community center, compared to the usual dozen. Karen sat at the front with other board members who had visibly distanced their chairs from hers. "As you all know, we've encountered some complications with our annual street festival," Karen began nervously. "The city has issued citations for alleged code violations, which the board is contesting." Jeff quickly corrected her. "Actually, the board has not voted to contest these citations. We're here to discuss how to address them." When Karen reluctantly admitted the $15,000 fine amount, angry murmurs filled the room. Jeff then revealed that Karen had pushed the festival decision through without proper quorum, with only 4 of 9 board members present and a split vote that she broke in her favor, a clear bylaw violation. The situation worsened when Harold, the HOA treasurer, raised another issue. The vendor fees collected at the festival were not deposited into the HOA account. "As treasurer, I have no record of this income." Karen's weak excuse that she hadn't had time to process the deposits met with skeptical silence. I chose this moment to stand and approach the front with my evidence folder. During the festival, I recorded multiple instances of Ms. Richardson collecting cash payments from vendors. 13 vendors paying $75 each, and 3 paying $125 for premium locations. That's $1,350 in vendor fees alone, not counting the $5 suggested donation at entry points. I presented time-stamped photographs and vendor statements confirming these transactions. Diana, the vice president, quickly moved to suspend Karen pending investigation. Despite Karen's protests, "You can't do this. I've led this HOA for 4 years." The board voted unanimously for suspension. As Karen gathered her belongings, she pointed accusingly at me. "This is all your fault. You could have just cooperated like everyone else. Instead, you've used your position to destroy everything I've built." I responded calmly, "Karen, you built a system based on intimidation and selective enforcement. You used HOA rules as weapons against those who questioned you while ignoring those same rules when they inconvenienced you. I didn't destroy anything, you did that yourself. My response drew applause as Karen stormed out. After the meeting, neighbors introduced themselves to me, many for the first time. Linda remarked, "I never imagined you'd end up bringing down the HOA tyrant." I smiled. I am the quiet type. I just also believe in accountability. Jeff apologized for the HOA's actions and thanked me for my measured approach. As I walked home, I reflected on the unexpected outcome. I had moved to Oak Ridge seeking a quiet life, but found myself at the center of a community transformation. Perhaps this was better, a neighborhood where rules existed to serve residents, not control them. A week after the emergency HOA meeting, Oak Ridge Estates began settling into a new rhythm under Diana and Jeff's interim leadership. I had almost thought the Karen saga was behind us when Linda knocked on my door Saturday morning, her expression a mixture of concern and excitement. "There's an email from Karen's attorney," she explained. "She's threatening to sue the HOA, the city, and you personally for conspiracy to defame and targeted harassment." I was more amused than concerned. On what grounds? Everything was fully documented and witnessed by dozens of people. Linda then shared the real bombshell. Jeff and Harold had discovered extensive financial discrepancies in the HOA accounts dating back years. Maintenance services had been billed at premium rates through companies owned by Karen's brother-in-law. Vendor payments for previous events showed inflated amounts. Most damning was the pattern of selective enforcement. Karen's friends had violations routinely forgiven, while others faced maximum penalties. "They're still digging," Linda explained, "but Harold estimates at least $30,000 has been misappropriated over the past 3 years. The board had filed a police report and hired an independent auditor. While we were discussing this, Jim called to tell me Karen had attempted to file a professional misconduct complaint against me at City Hall, but quickly withdrew it when informed about perjury penalties for false statements." That afternoon, Jeff brought me a red leather ledger he'd found hidden in the HOA office. "It's Karen's personal record," he explained. The ledger contained disturbing details of Karen's management techniques, including which residents were problems, which could be leveraged, and a careful accounting of diverted funds. My name appeared repeatedly with notations like "too observant," "needs pressure," and "find violation to force compliance." The final entry read, "Corner lot, perfect for festival. Owner objecting but will back down when threatened with multiple violations. Estimate $2,000 profit from vendor fees." Jeff also warned me that Karen was trying to rally supporters against me, though with little success. 2 days later, I noticed a police car outside Karen's house. By evening, news had spread that Karen had been arrested for embezzlement and fraud. The investigation revealed financial misconduct extending beyond the HOA to her workplace and other community organizations. The local newspaper ran a front-page story about the neighborhood tyrant finally being exposed. In the following months, Oak Ridge Estates transformed. The HOA revised its covenant to include clearer guidelines and proper checks and balances. The city reduced the festival fines in exchange for a community education workshop on code compliance, which I helped organize. Neighbors who had previously avoided each other began connecting, even establishing a community garden in a common area, a project Karen had repeatedly blocked as attracting undesirable elements. 6 months later, at a properly permitted community picnic, Diana thanked me not just for exposing Karen's schemes, but for showing them how to run things correctly. "It's like everyone can finally breathe again," she observed. Karen eventually accepted a plea deal, receiving probation and a substantial fine. Her house sold quickly, and the neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief when she moved away. My front yard, once the battlefield for a neighborhood power struggle, was now simply a pleasant space where I could enjoy morning coffee on the porch, exchanging friendly waves with passing neighbors. I received a letter from the city manager commending my handling of the situation and offering me a promotion to head a new community compliance education initiative. The experience had transformed not just our neighborhood, but my own sense of belonging. I had moved to Oak Ridge seeking quiet, privacy, but discovered something more valuable. A genuine community where rules serve to protect everyone, not just the power-hungry few. If you've ever faced your own neighborhood tyrant, or found yourself standing up for what's right when it would have been easier to stay quiet, I'd love to hear your story. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not in courtrooms or on battlefields, but in community centers and front yards, one principled stand at a time. Always know your rights, document everything, and never underestimate the power of one person who refuses to be bullied, even by someone with a clipboard and an HOA rule book.